What's up, everybody? I'm Matt Gary, and in this episode of Coding with the Force, we're going to go over absolutely everything that has to do with SOQL, the Salesforce Object Query Language, and SOSL, the Salesforce Object Search Language, so that you know how to both efficiently and effectively query for data in your Apex code. All right, everybody. So today we are going to go over both of Salesforce's query languages, the Salesforce Object Query Language, or SOQL, and the Salesforce Object Search Language, or SOSL. And, we'll figure out the differences between the two and when to use one over the other. And more importantly, we will figure out absolutely everything about both of these languages. From the basics of just setting up a very simple query to some of the more advanced features in both of these languages for querying. And we'll also go over some of the really advanced stuff, like, how to figure out how efficient your queries are so that you make sure that you have really, efficient and effective queries so you don't get yourself into trouble when your tables grow and your data grows in your org and you have billions of records in a Salesforce table or Salesforce object. And we'll go over some things like asynchronous SOQL as well, which are pretty handy when you get into bigger and bigger instances and you get more and more data. So we're going to go over everything from the basics to the more advanced stuff. And by the end of this, my hope is that you will know absolutely everything that you need to know to be successful in virtually any situation you could find yourself in when you're querying for data in your Salesforce org. But before we get into absolutely everything about SOQL and SOSL, make sure if you enjoy this video to like it, because when you do, it helps this video get out to more people just like you that want to learn about this stuff for free too. So you enjoy the video, like it. Now let's get back to everything about SOQL and SOSL. So with that said, the first couple things we need to do, we'll just start with the first one. The first thing that we need to do is figure out what the point of these languages are. What is the point of SOQL and what is the point of SOSL? And for both of them, the point is to be able to, in your code, right, in your Apex code, to be able to query for records in your Salesforce objects so that you'll be able to manipulate that data in your Apex, right? So basically, when we're writing these queries, we want to retrieve records from one or potentially more of our objects so that we can, loop through those records or iterate over those records and make updates to them or modify them or delete them or whatever, right? And SOQL and SOSL are how we retrieve that data to work with it. So it's extremely important. It's one of the foundational building blocks. So if you have no idea what SOQL is, and you've been struggling trying to figure out how to actually manipulate the data in your Salesforce org, this is your answer. So by the end of this, you'll be able to do that really, really easily, and you'll have a good time. The second thing is, for all of you who are coming over from another programming language, another tech stack that use SQL or SQL, which is the structured query language. SQL stands for structured query language. SOQL has some similar characteristics, but it's very different. So, unfortunately, it's not really a one-to-one transfer. When I came over from a language that used SQL, it helped me, but there was still so much I needed to learn about SOQL to be able to, write efficient queries that did what I needed them to do and all that kind of stuff. So, with those couple of introductory things and that groundwork set, let's figure out together how to build a SOQL query. Okay, so before we actually write any Apex code that uses, SOQL, The first thing that we need to figure out is just how to write a SOQL query in general. How do we structure a SOQL query? What does the basic structure of a SOQL query mean? All that kind of stuff. And the easiest way to show this is by using the dev console. So the first thing that we're going to do, you will rarely see me use the dev console in my videos, but for learning purposes, I do think this is the easiest thing to learn how to write SOQL queries in. So the first thing that we're going to do is open up the dev console, and to do that, you'll just click this gear over here in Salesforce and click on the developer console. And the developer console will probably spaz out on you, just like it always does for me. But whenever you get over here to the dev console, you'll notice that there's a tab down here on the bottom called the query editor. And you'll click the query editor, and in this box here, we will write our queries together, right? And I'm just going to write a simple query for you and explain what that simple query is doing, so that we can kind of get just the absolute basics under our belt here. So what I'm going to do is say select ID and name from account. And what this query is going to do when I press this execute button down here in just a minute is it's going to select the fields ID and name and return the values of those fields, the value in the ID field and the values in the name field from the account records on our account object, right? So basically we're saying we want to query for records on the account object or from the account object. And we would like, when those records are returned, to have the ID and the name field data returned to us as well. And like that, those are the only fields data that we need returned to us, right? So when we run this and hit execute, you'll see that we get the ID field and the name field of all of these accounts in my system. I'm very surprised. I've done enough tutorials in random junk to have 2,458 account records in my dev org. But basically, what you can see here is we've got a bunch of accounts, and we've got their names, and we've got their IDs, just like we've requested right here in our SOQL query, which is pretty cool, right? And that is the basics, just the absolute basics of writing a query. You're going to select the fields that you'd like from an object that you'd like. And there's a lot more to this, and we're going to go over all the different building blocks of SOQL queries, but this at its foundational level is what you're doing. You're selecting the data from fields from an object that you want that data from, right? So in this instance, I want it from the account object, but maybe I wanted it from a contact object or a custom object in my system or whatever else. So really important to know. Now, there's a couple of other things that I just want to talk about when you're building these queries, just in case you're unfamiliar with them. The first couple things are, number one, how do you know the names of the field, and how do you know the name of an object that you want to query from, query data from? And if you're not super familiar with querying, I'm going to assume that you're also probably not super familiar with how you figure out what field, what the name of your field is, the API name more specifically, and what the API name of your object is. And it's really easy to figure out the API name of your object and the API name of your field if you go to Setup and you go to the wonderful Object Manager over here, and you find your object that you care about. So let's see. Let me see if I can find a custom object in here somewhere. I think I just went by one. So I've got this custom object in here, and I want to query for the data in this custom object. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this custom object name here, and I can see in the details section of this custom object that the API name is org related list user preference. And so this, if I go back into the dev console, is the object that I'm going to query from, query data from now. So I would put this in, this API name in here for my object, and then I would go into fields and relationships and figure out the names of the fields, the API names more specifically, which are under field name here. Now, you may have seen that some fields just look like this. They don't have this __ C, and other fields do have this __ C, and the same thing for objects. If you're not super familiar with this, anytime that you create a custom field or a custom object, they are postfixed with an __ C. So all this __ C means is that it's not a standard field, it's a custom one. And when you don't see __ C, it means it's a system generated standard field. Okay, so I'm going to grab, a couple of fields here. We'll just say field names to exclude from table, and we'll bring back up our dev console, and we'll add that here to our list of fields that we would like to select, right? And if I hit execute on this, we can see that it did indeed return to us the only result, apparently the only record that I have in this table, and it has no data in this fields to exclude from table, but we at least know that it has no data in here because it's blank. So that's kind of how you'll go about finding the object names and the object field names that you want to query for. And it's really important that you know how to do that, because very often the names, the API names of your objects or of your fields are actually different from the display names that you'll see in your Salesforce org. So just understand that when you're making these queries, you need to go, if you don't already know the names of the fields, to the object manager, find the object that you care about, copy its API name, and use that API name in the from statement. And you need to find the names of your fields by going to the fields and relationships section and copying and pasting the fields from there. Okay, now I think that covers the absolute basics of a SOQL query. So the next thing that we're going to go over is figuring out how to, limit the data that we return, or filter the data that we return by taking a look at where clauses, in clauses, and the limit clause in SOQL queries. All right, so there's a lot to talk about when it comes to filtering out records from your SOQL queries. Or, I just want to address this real quick. I know there's a lot of people out there that think or believe that it's pronounced SOQL, and you're probably right. But I'm the SOQL guy. So you're going to hear two different pronunciations, SOQL, SOQL. Sorry if I've said it wrong. But I pronounce it SOQL. So now that we're over that, let's get back to what we're talking about. The filtering of queries. When we're talking about filtering queries, one of the things that comes up the most when I'm teaching brand new people about filtering queries is, why do I care to filter a query in the first place, right? If I just query for all the data in a Salesforce table or a Salesforce object, then I've got all the data. And now I can do whatever I want to with it. I can filter it out in the code, or I can do whatever else. And I totally see that argument at face level, but once you kind of figure out how things work, if you do that, it will not work out for you in the long run. And that's for a bunch of reasons. for performance reasons and for the most common reason of all, Salesforce limits, which are present everywhere when you work in Salesforce. So let's go over the limits and then we'll talk about the performance stuff. Just like with everything else, SOQL has limits. And in most cases, when you are doing a SOQL query, you are going to be limited to only returning up to 50,000 records in the entirety of your Apex transactions. So not just in one query, but in all the queries that happen in the course of a single Apex transaction, which you might have a lot. So if you're querying for all the records in every table, you're going to hit that 50,000 records pretty quick in most instances, unless you have a really, really, really small org. The second thing is, once your tables grow to a certain size in Salesforce, in the millions of records, I don't even think they're like hundreds of thousands of records, there are also indexing limitations on your SOQL queries. Your SOQL query has to be a certain level, abide by the. It's difficult for me to go over with somebody who has no background of SOQL query. We're going to go over this more in the advanced section down the line, but just know that there's something called indexing limits. And once your table hits a certain size, that becomes really important, or else your queries are just not going to operate. And we're going to talk more about this indexing limitation a little further down this video once we get through all of the other kind of basic details. But I don't want to bog us down right now. Just know that that's a really important limit that comes into play with these filtering mechanisms here. The last thing is performance, right? SOQL queries, if you didn't know, are probably the least performant thing in your code. As in, they're going to take the most amount of time to run than most of the things that you're going to write in your code. If you go and kind of benchmark what takes the longest in your code, chances are your queries are always going to be the things that take the longest, unless you just got some really bad Apex that you've written. So the more that you can filter these queries, the more performant that your queries are going to be, which are going to save you time when your code is executing. And that's important because there is a limit where you can only have your code run up to 10 seconds before Salesforce says, hey, your code's run too long. We're not going to attempt to continue this code execution here, and they'll just shut it off, right? So, or they'll just stop your code from executing. They're not going to shut down your Salesforce instance or anything. I don't want you to get confused. So they're going to stop your code from executing if it takes more than 10 seconds. So where clauses and filtering out your data becomes super important for all those reasons. So now that we kind of have a background as to why filtering is important and the benefits you get for it, let's figure out how we actually filter in practice, right? So I'm going to go back to the accounts table and we'll say select ID name. Oops, I forgot the from account where an account's name is equal to taco. Because I have a feeling I've got a few accounts out there that I named taco. So basically what we're saying in this query now is we want the data from the ID and name field from the account object where from every record that has a name of taco. And we only care about the records that have a name of taco for our account object. And thankfully I was right, and I've named some accounts taco, which doesn't surprise me at all. And we've returned only those two rows which were named taco, which is pretty cool. And you can see that that ran pretty fast. If I drop the where account name equals taco, you can see that took, like a second, right? Where in comparison, the other one took just, it was basically instant. It was basically there as soon as it loaded. The other one, we had about a second lag there where it loaded. And in your code, that will actually take even longer. this query editor seems to be just a little bit faster than when this is actually executing in Apex. And the more rows you have, the slower it gets. You have 50, 60, 70, 100,000 rows. This can take forever and ever to populate because we're gathering up a lot of data and a lot of rows. So just by adding this name filter, we've got a better query. We've already narrowed it down to just the things that we care about. And so our code has less to do, and we have a faster query out of it, a more performant query. Now, you can filter on virtually any field that you can think of, aside from rich text fields and long area text fields. Those are not filterable field types, so I'm sorry. But you can't use those field types to filter in your queries. But let's take a look at now that we know what the where clause is, the importance of the where clause, all that kind of stuff. Let's take a look at the many different ways in which we can filter our data because they're pretty cool and there are a lot of them. Okay, so the next thing that we should go over is probably logical operators. And logical operators are the and, or, and not operators that you can use in these where clauses. Not is a logical operator that you will not often see, but it is still important to know that it exists and how to leverage it. So we're going to go over it in just a bit, but we're going to start with the and the or logical operators. So right now we have a SOQL query set up, and we have this where clause in here that filters out our accounts and only gives us accounts with the name Taco in it. But what if we want to not only filter it out based on the fact that an account's name is Taco, but we also need it to have an annual revenue equal to 12,000, or maybe an annual revenue greater than 12,000. To do that, we would use the and clause, right? And now what we're saying is we want all the accounts where the account's name is Taco and it has an annual revenue of 12,000. And so if we run this query now, what we're going to end up with is nothing, because none of our records, none of the records in my system anyway, have an annual revenue filled out. So we went from 2 accounts now down to 0 accounts because no accounts meet both criteria here. None of them have the name Taco and an annual revenue of 12,000. So it's important to know that this exists because you can chain a whole bunch of and clauses together to get more and more specific about what account you would like, what accounts you would actually like returned. So you can get really specific with your query results, which is great. The more specific you can get, the better. Now, what if though you wanted all the accounts where the name was Taco or the annual revenue was 12,000? So you don't need them both to be true. You only need one of them to be true. In that case, we would use the or logical operator, which basically now says, I want all of the accounts where the name is equal to Taco or the annual revenue is greater than 12,000. And if I execute this now, we can see that there are a bunch that fall into this category, right? Because there are accounts in existence that have an annual revenue greater than 12,000, and there are 2 accounts, as we saw before, that had the name Taco. So This OR operator gives you the ability to have, one or more of these true, and if if any of these essentially criteria that you set up for this where clause are true, then the records will be returned, right? And OR means one or the other is true, not that both are true, like and. And so, it's pretty useful and pretty cool. These logical operators are super important to use and to know they exist because you can get really, really specific with your queries. Another thing that's really important to know about logical operators is you can use parentheses to make even more complex filter criteria. So for instance, right now we have where the name is equal to taco or it's equal to annual revenue of greater than 12,000. But what if we wanted one of these to be even more specific? We could wrap this in parentheses and say an annual revenue greater than 12,000 and name is equal to, see one of these in here, Gene Point, right? So now what this criteria is telling the SOQL query to return is any accounts where the name is taco or any accounts where the annual revenue is greater than 12,000 and the name is equal to Gene Point. So we can see that there's one that exists here. And if we execute this query now, we're only going to get 3 results. We've got the one account that's name is Gene Point and that's annual revenue is over 12,000. And then we also have our 2 taco accounts still. So through the use of these parentheses to kind of essentially bundle bundle filter criteria together, then we can get these kind of really specific filter criteria grouped together in different places. So if you ever need criteria like this, where one thing is true or another grouping of things is true, just use parentheses and you can start to group things together like you see here. Now, the last one that we need to go over is not. And basically what you would do for not is you would say, and they're not like this, right? So now what I'm asking for is any account where the name is taco or any account that does not have an annual revenue over 12,000 and a name of Gene Point. So if I hit execute now, we should get a whole bunch of results, quite a few, right? 2,457, because these are all the accounts that don't have an annual revenue of greater than 12,000 and a name of Gene Point, which is basically everything except for that one account, right? So pretty cool. Not is useful. So it's good to know that it exists. You won't see it in practice a lot, but it can be useful from time to time. All right, now that we've gone over logical operators, we should go over comparison operators because there are some pretty awesome ones that we have yet to go over, and they're important. It's important you know about them because filtering these queries is one of, if not the most important things that you will do when writing them. All right, so we've gone over our logical operators together, the AND statement, the OR statement, and the NOT statement, but we still haven't gone over what comparison operators are. And we've actually already used a couple of them. This equal sign where we say name is equal to taco, the greater than sign where we said annual revenue is greater than 12,000. But there are several more, and there's a couple of unique ones that you will use relatively often for SOQL queries. So let's bring them up over here and take a look at them. Now, the first handful are pretty straightforward. Equals, not equals, less than or equal to, greater, and greater than or equal to, right? These are pretty basic things that I'm pretty sure you can deduce what they do. This means that a string or the field is equal to a specific thing. This is not equal to a specific thing. That's less than, or equal to, greater than or equal to. I'm not going to go over those anymore. But there's a handful of comparison operators that are unique to SOQL that you may not be familiar with, like the like operator. And the like operator basically allows you to say, hey, I would like all of the records where a text field is like this string, right? It's not exactly this string of characters, but it's pretty close, right? And we're going to do an example together here in just a second to show you more about that. But basically, the like operator is saying, you know, I want a string that's pretty close to the one that I've got here, but not exactly. So it's kind of like a fuzzy matching type thing, if you're familiar with that terminology. The other comparison operator that operators that we have are the in clause. This is one that you will use all of the time, or the in comparison operator. You're going to use this one all of the time. So we're definitely going to do an example of this together. But essentially what we're saying, you know, if you see this example here, is we want all accounts where the billing state has a value of either California or New York. And we have not in, which is the opposite. So we want a billing state that does not have California or New York in it. Or we want accounts that do not have the billing state of California and New York in them. And then we have this includes and excludes comparison operator, which is unique to multi-select pick lists, and we'll briefly go over that in just a bit as well. So let's bring back up the good old-fashioned dev console and take a look at this. So right now we have the query so that we have a name equal to taco, right? But what if we didn't want it to equal taco? We just wanted it to be like taco. You know, maybe it's not just taco that we have, but we have Taco Bell and Taco Tuesday as an account, and Taco Thursday and Taco Trouble, and who knows what else, right? There's a lot of accounts out there that have the string taco in the name, but there could be a whole bunch of different varieties. And the way that we deal with that is with the like operator, the like comparison operator. And so now I can say, I would like all of my accounts where the name is like taco, and I can tell it how I want it to compare the strings in this name field. So basically what I'm saying here with this percentage sign, which is called a wildcard character, is I'm saying I would like all accounts where the name starts with taco, but it can end with anything, essentially. So if I run this now, I've got two accounts. I've got my taco account and I've got Taco Bell. Whereas if this was just equal, all I'd get was taco, right? So now I've got two accounts, Taco and Taco Bell, which is pretty cool. Again, if I just made this equal to taco again, all we get is taco. But with that like statement, we get all of the strings in the name field that have taco and anything after them. Now, you might also want the reverse. You might just want it so that, you know, anything can happen at the beginning, but we need taco to be in there in the end, right? So the string can start with anything, but it has to have taco in there. And if we, you know, run that query, you can see that Taco Bell disappears, but we get extra taco, which is the name of an account. So that is also an available option to you. Or maybe you want to just see if taco kind of exists in that text field at all, right? Maybe we just want to say, okay, we want to find all accounts where the name just has taco in it. Now, I will say, when we get into query performance more in the advanced section of this video here. This is going to end up in you taking a pretty big performance hit and can have problems with query indexing. But for the sake of showing you how this works, if I do this now, you can see you get extra taco, taco, and Taco Bell because we can match on both. We're essentially saying at this point we just want taco to be in the string somewhere. Not at the start, not at the end, but somewhere, right? So that's kind of how this like operator works. There's also another wildcard that you can use for this like operator, and it's an underscore, like so. And you will very rarely see this used, but basically what this means is there is one more character, just a single character after this that it can match on. So for instance, this could match on an account named Taco. It could also match on an account named Tack. It could match on an account named, I don't know, Tackle or something. But if we execute this, you can see I still get back taco despite not having a letter in here. It's basically just saying I want one character after it. So when you see those underscores, that's what it means. It's matching on a single character instead of just like infinite characters, essentially, which is what that percentage sign does. Okay, so now we know how to use the like statement. I definitely hope at least. Let's take a look at the in statement. So we kind of looked at it in that example, but basically we're going to write something like where an account name is in this set of data, and maybe we want chocolate or something like that. So basically what this is saying now is I want all the accounts where the name has either the value taco or the value chocolate. And if I execute this, I don't think I have any chocolates, unfortunately, but you see that I get the value taco back, right? So I still get that taco account. Let's see if I can find some other. I have a list of all my accounts, yeah. So maybe I want to find all my cool accounts too, like so. And then you can see it brings back a lot of results. I've got all of my cool accounts back, and I also have my taco account here. The not in clause is essentially the reverse. So this is going to return all of the rows in which, or all of the records in which, that aren't named taco or cool account. So if I hit execute on this one, we're going to get a whole bunch of rows again, but basically they're all rows that are not taco, or all the accounts that are not named taco or cool account. And the last one that we have, again, only applies to multi-select pick lists. Let me just bring this up if I can find it. Multi-select pick lists are kind of unique entities. When you use a multi-select pick list, essentially what happens is it writes a string in the background, or it writes to a text field essentially in the background. And when you have multiple selections, they're split up by a semicolon, right? So it's like, in this example that they have here, if you queried for your multi-select pick list and it had selected AAA and BBB, then AAA semicolon BBB is what would get returned to you in a string. If you haven't heard, multi-select pick lists are kind of a pain. But you can also use this includes setup here for multi-select pick lists so that you can say, if my multi-select pick list selection includes AAA and BBB, or it includes just CCC, then it can figure that out, right? And it's the reverse for excludes, if I wanted to figure out if it didn't have CCC in it or something, then I can just use EXCLUDES and say return to me all records where CCC has not been selected in my multi-select pick list if I used the EXCLUDES instead of INCLUDES. So that's kind of all it's used for. It's kind of unique, and you know, if you get yourself into multi-select pick lists enough, you will probably find yourself using that from time to time. But just so you know that it exists, it is kind of useful. It's kind of useful to know about. So, yeah. The last thing that I want to point out about filtering your data using where clauses, or just filtering your data in SOQL queries in general, is that if you try to filter data with encrypted fields, it's not going to work. So if you didn't know, you can encrypt your fields in Salesforce. And there are a lot of reasons that you might want to do that to safeguard your data for one reason or another, especially sensitive data. But for those fields that are encrypted, you're not going to be able to filter on them in your SOQL queries. You're also not going to be able to order on them. And there's lots of other things that you can't do with encrypted fields in general. But just know that if you are using a field that you feel like should be working and should meet criteria, if it's encrypted, you're going to be presented with errors that say that you can't filter on that field. So just be aware, all encrypted fields are basically not going to allow you to do anything filter-wise. So I think that's it for filtering. Now we've got kind of our tools in place. You know how to use comparison operators and logical operators and how the where clause works, I hope. The next thing that we should go over is the order by clause. And what the order by clause allows us to do is essentially organize our data when it's returned to us, when we query for it, right? And you might say, well, what do I care for? Why do I need to order my data? What's the point? Well, maybe you have a list that you're presenting to your users. Maybe you have a data table and you want to present to them a whole bunch of records. And you want them to be in alphabetical order. Well, if you just order your SOQL query, then you don't have to do anything else, right? Your SOQL, if you use this order by clause, you can order your records however you'd like them ordered on one or multiple fields, and then you can just display that data to your user without having to do a bunch of operations on it to get it in a format that the users would like to see it in. And to do that ordering is pretty easy. You just use the order by clause in your SOQL query, like so. And if I wanted to order by name, I could do that. So by default, I believe the results are ordered in ascending. So ascending order is going to be like A, B, C, D, E, F, G, like so. And if we hit execute, you're going to see that I'm ordering by name, and it's ordering in ascending order, so A down to the letter Z, if I have any accounts that start with Z. But if I wanted it to be in descending order, I didn't want it to be A to Z, I wanted it to be Z to A, you can actually use descending, like so. And it will switch it up, and now it's starting with the University of Arizona, because I guess that is as far as I go in the alphabet, to the letter U for my account names. And it goes down to, the A's all the way to the bottom. So that's kind of how you would order things by name. If you wanted to just denote that you were doing it ascending, you can also use ASC, which stands for ascending in SOQL, and we'll get the same as we got before. But it's not actually necessary to put ASC. It will only ever be necessary to put DESC for descending, because this is the default functionality for SOQL to present things in ascending order. There are a few other things you should know about the order by clause. The first is that you can order by multiple fields. So I could also add annual revenue in here, and it will take that annual revenue field into consideration when it's ordering things. So you can kind of order by as many fields as you would like to. The second thing is that if you don't add the fields that you're ordering by to the fields that you've selected in here, what you'll find is it won't order by them, right? And that's because it doesn't actually have the data to order them. So even though you'll get it returned, you won't actually see your data organized by that particular field. So make sure that if you're ordering by it, to also include it in your selected fields here. The last is another option where you can say whether or not you'd like your nulls to show up first or your nulls to show up last, like so. And what that means is, say for instance, I've got annual revenue here. Let's just remove the order by name field and just order by annual revenue. I've got my annual revenue here, and what I want are for all of my null annual revenues to show up last in my list. So if I do that, what should happen is the annual revenues that are filled out will show up first in my list, and all the rest that are null will show up at the end of my list. Alternatively, if I did nulls first, the reverse would happen. Annual revenues that were null would be at the top, and the ones that were filled out would be at the bottom. But I'm not able to view them right now because they fall outside the range of 2,000 records that are being displayed to me. So that's pretty much it as far as it goes for ordering. This will just make your life, a little bit easier in a lot of cases where you're presenting this data. You won't have to, do any manual ordering in your code. This will just allow you to kind of organize your data as it comes in from the SOQL query. The next clause that we should talk about is the limit clause. And the limit clause is basically a clause that allows you in your SOQL query to say, I only want this amount of records returned to me no matter what. So for instance, right now this query returns to me 2,440 records. But maybe I only ever want it to return, no matter what, 2,000 records. I can just place this statement in here and say, I want to limit this query to a total of 2,000 records. And if I hit execute, what you'll notice is, even though it's the exact same query that previously returned 2,440 records, I only got 2,000. And that is because I've added this limit clause. So there are times in your code that you will find, that you'll run into, where you only want to return maybe the first 200 results or the first 5,000 results or something like that, right? Maybe just one result. You just want the first result that you get. And using this limit is going to allow you, this limit clause is going to allow you to do that. So just know that this exists. There are certain circumstances you'll get into to, where you'll want this or need this. And if nothing else, make sure you limit your queries to a maximum of 50,000. Again, that's per transaction, but you at least don't want a single query going over it, or else it's going to hit limits, right? So in most cases, we'll go over the rare cases where that's not true soon enough. But that limit clause allows you to limit the amount of records that get returned to you when you do a SOQL query. So definitely leverage that wherever you can. The last SOQL clause that we're going to go over before we go over some more advanced SOQL stuff and start using SOQL in actual Apex is the offset clause. And the offset clause is super useful when you have a lot of data that you need to display to a user but you don't necessarily want to display it all at once, right? Or you can't display it all at once because it would just be too slow and be detrimental to the user, be a detrimental user experience because everything would load so slow and all that. So that's really where the offset clause comes in handy. And basically what you're going to do is say, offset, and then tell it the amount of records you would like to offset. So for instance, right now, I just did a query where I had 2,440 rows returned to me. This is basically all the accounts in the system. And I would like to offset this by 500 accounts, which means that when I run this query, the first 500 accounts are going to get dropped. They're not going to be visible, or they're not going to be returned in my query to me. Instead, only accounts 501 onward are going to get returned. So what I hope to see is a total rows returned of 1,940, because 2440 minus 500 would be 1,940. So if I hit execute, I now have only 1,940 records returned to me because I have offset my records by 500. And if I offset them by 1,000, we'd have 1,440, and so on. So what this allows you to do is kind of paginate your queries through this offset mechanism. So, you could imagine a user's viewing 200 records or something, and they click the next page button, and what that does is it goes back to your query, offsets it by 200, and then it returns the next 200 results to them, or something along those lines. And that's a really useful way to, return small subsets of data for a giant set of data to display to your users. So offset is really, really valuable, and it's something that you should take into consideration, especially when you have a lot of records that you're displaying to users in a user interface. All right, the next thing that we need to go over with SOQL queries are how to query for related records, right? So for instance, maybe on the account, I want to query for all of the contacts related to me and get all of the data about those contacts. How can I do that in a SOQL query? Additionally, maybe I'm a contact and I want to get data about the account that I'm linked to. How do we do that in a SOQL query? And if you're unaware, in Salesforce, the way that these connections are made are through what are called lookup fields or master detail relationship fields. And so real quick, before we figure out how to actually query for these related records or this related data in our queries, let's just take a look at what lookup fields are and how they kind of link our objects, or really our database tables, together. So if we come back over here to the object manager and we take a look at, say, the contact object, and we look at fields in relationship, we can see that we have this field called account name, and it is what's referred to as a lookup to account. And basically what this means is our two objects are connected. Really, an object in Salesforce is a database table, if you're not aware. So this is how we connect our database tables together and relate them to each other in Salesforce through these lookup relationships. So anytime that you have a lookup relationship or a master detail relationship on your object in Salesforce, you'll be able in your SOQL queries to query for related information about those records or that record in the lookup field. Additionally, if I'm on the account object, because I know that the account object the contact object has a lookup to the account object, I can query for all of the contacts related to the accounts that I'm, currently querying for as well. So we can query for that relationship data much like you can in structured query language, or SQL, in what are called inner and outer joins. They're quite a bit different, and they're quite a bit more limited than what you can do with SQL joins, but there's still some functionality there, and that's what we're going to take a look at, is how do we join that data together into a single query, right? All right, so let's take a shot at that by opening up the dev console again. And, okay. And opening up the query editor, and this time we're going to query for the for contacts, right? And we're going to take a look at two types of relationship queries, but the first one that we're going to take a look at is querying from a child lookup relationship to its parent. So we're going to do a parent relationship query because I think this is a little easier to grasp. All right, so let's write our query. First, we're going to select ID and maybe the first name field from contact. And we'll say where first name equals Jambet. I'm pretty sure I got at least one Jambet in there, if not a whole bunch more. And when we want to query for data on our account lookup field, since this is a standard out-of-the-box field, right? These are going to be different than the custom fields. We're going to take a look at both how you query for related data on standard fields, standard lookup fields, and custom lookup fields. But since this is a standard lookup field, it says its API name here is account ID. So let's just grab that, bring it over here, and drop it in here. Now, if I just query for account ID, I'm just going to get the Salesforce generated ID for that account, which could be useful to you or it might not be useful to you. I don't know. Depends on your situation, right? But if I wanted, say, for instance, to query for the name of the account, well, let's just see what this comes up with for now. So I just get the ID, right? Not super helpful. But maybe I want more information about this account. Well, for standard fields, basically what you're going to do is drop the ID and put a dot operator and write the name of the field after that dot that you want to grab information about and hit execute. And now you can see that Jambet is related to an account whose name is Jambo James. And, if I also wanted, say, for instance, the account annual revenue again, then I can do that as well and bring that in here. And that's kind of how you get information from your lookup fields, from your related, your records that are related or linked to your contact. The other thing is maybe you want to, in your where clause, filter based on your lookup field or lookup fields, and you can do that too. So you can say account dot name is equal to Jambo James, like so, and we'll get that back. But if I just made it where it's equal to Jumbo or Jambo, you get nothing, right? So you can filter by these fields too, which is super useful and really important to know. Now, a really key distinction here is we just took a look at a standard out-of-the-box lookup field, as in when I installed Salesforce, that account ID, well, you don't really install Salesforce, my apologies, but when I set up Salesforce, when the Salesforce instance was set up for me, you know, it had this field already on the contact object. And there's tons of these pre-made fields for you, and they're referred to as standard fields. But what if I created a custom lookup field to another object in my system? So if I come in here and I create a lookup relationship and I make it to, who knows, it could be anything. We'll say it's a lookup to order, sure. Then after I create this field, you're going to see that we query for it in a little bit different of a way. And we'll get through it someday, some way, maybe. And now if I look for that order field that I just made, you can see that it is a lookup to the order object, but it's got the field name of order underscore underscore C, which, as we talked about before, underscore underscore C just means that it's a custom field that we custom made for our org to do whatever we wanted it to do. Now, if I wanted to query for related data on this order underscore underscore C field, what I have to do is change the underscore underscore C to an underscore underscore R, at which point I can query for whatever related information I'd like to query for. It's been a little while since I've used the order object. So let's see, maybe we want the order end date. We hit execute, you can see we don't have one because it's null. The order field is null. But that underscore underscore R is how you're going to query for custom lookup or custom master detail relationship fields that you create on your objects. Whereas for out of the box lookups, you're just going to drop the ID. So if you remember originally this was account ID, you're going to drop the ID off of it, add a dot, and follow it by the name of the field that you'd like to retrieve information about, right? Retrieve data for. And that's kind of how we go from child to parent to grab data in SOQL queries. The next thing that we're going to take a look at is how to go from a parent to a child and grab data about all of the children in your parent-child relationship. And this one is a little bit trickier. Getting child relationship data is really not that difficult, but it's a little trickier, especially the first time that you do it. Because figuring out how to properly query for it and then deal with the data is just, it's kind of a whole new thing, right? It's different from what we've done so far, kind of. So we know that this contact object, right, has a lookup to the account object, right? And we literally just went over this. So because it has a lookup relationship to account, we know that accounts have contacts that get linked to them, right, in the database, or you know, our account and our contact objects are linked together. So what we need to now do is see if we can query for our contact here, you know, Jambette, when we're querying on the account object for Jumbo James here. So let's delete this query that we've got going on right here and create another one and say select ID name from account where name is equal to Jumbo James, like so. Now all this is going to do right now is do what we are used to it doing, which is give us back the name Jumbo James and an ID. So how do we return all of the contacts that are linked to this account, that have a lookup to this account, right? That is the question. And the way that we are going to do that is first, we're going to take a look at that relationship field on contact, the account name field, and find this thing down here called child relationship name. And this child relationship name is how you are going to figure out, it's basically how you're going to query for your contacts, right, within your account query. So we need to grab this and copy it. And once you have that from your lookup field, you're going to come back over here and we are going to say select ID name and put a comma and then put 2 parentheses, and we're going to write another SQL query within this one. So we're going to say select ID first name from contacts, right? Not contact, but contacts, because that is what the relationship name of this lookup field is. And so once we have that in place, if we hit execute, what we will get is the ID, the name, and then what's called a JSON string or a JSON representation, or basically an object representation of the contacts that are linked to this account Jumbo James. And if we take a look at that, we've got a couple. We've got Jambet here and a couple people named Batchable. Well, quite a few people named Batchable. So you can see we got a whole bunch of contacts returned to us in this list of contacts, which is pretty cool. And so that's a really easy way to figure out, everything that's related to this one account. The last couple things I want to show you about these relationships are one real quick thing, which is around a custom fields again. The place where you find this child relationship name on a custom field is just a little different than where you find it on an out-of-the-box field. So you'll notice that it's not right up here. You don't see that child relationship name right up here, but if you scroll down just a little bit, you can see that it's right there, child relationship name contacts for this other one as well. So if I was querying, for instance, on the order object instead of the account object, I would do the exact same thing, select ID first name from contacts, just like so, but it'd be on order, order instead of account. The last thing that I just want to go over with you guys before we run away from relationships and start talking about some other important things about queries and getting into Apex is, if you're in an org that you're really not super familiar with and you don't want to have to go through your entire object list and figure out what's related and what's not, you can go to what's called the Schema Builder and start looking into things. And this is really quite a bit easier way to figure out your relationships between tables. So for instance, I maybe want to look at my contact table, right? And well, let's auto lay this out. And we can see from our contact table, this is kind of like a more traditional database table view. So anybody that's coming over from a different language or tech stack, this might be a lot easier to figure things out. But this is an easier way to kind of take a look at the fields and the lookup relationships and the master detail relationships that link your tables together. So, you could see something like lookup user and this last modified date, and then you can just come right over here in your object and find user and add that table. And then you can start seeing the relationships from user to these objects as well. So this Schema Builder is a really good way to figure out all of these relationships and how you can start incorporating object data into your related object data into your queries. So really useful to know this exists, especially if it's your first time in an org. Really, really handy tool to take a look at. So, all right, with that said, now we're going to get into a couple of other SOQL related things. Some stuff around security and SOQL queries, grouping, fields, a bunch of other stuff. So let's get into these more specific, I guess, maybe less used but important features that you should know about SOQL before we get into actually writing some Apex for it. Okay, so the next thing that we should go over real quick are the couple of clauses that you can add to your SOQL queries that take security into consideration. And those two clauses are with security enforced and using scope. And this with security enforced clause that you can add to your SOQL queries basically just allows you to take your object and field level security into consideration when you're querying. So the object and field level security are the things that you set up on your profiles, your permission sets. So for instance, if this query was written and got executed in the code, but the user that was running the code didn't actually have access to, say, the last name field on contacts, well, then this data for the last name field would be stripped out so that the user wouldn't see things that they shouldn't see. So very useful. This is one of the newer clauses for SOQL. Very, very useful. Makes your life quite a bit simpler than it used to be when it comes to doing those field level security and object security based checks. The other one is the using scope clause, and the using scope clause is more around record level security. So basically what using scope is going to do is say, only return data that has been delegated to a user to take on. So for instance, you can delegate task records to a user to do. You can use everything, which is just silly. There's no reason to do this, but basically it'll allow you to see all records. Mine are all records that are owned by the current running user. Mine and my groups are all the, records owned by that user and the queue that the user is working in. My territory, if you're using enterprise territory management, it's all the records that are owned by users in your territory. Team territory, scoping rule, and team can also be used here. So basically, you just have ways to kind of filter the scope or the amount of records or the scope of the records that you're having returned, right? And so this can make record level security get taken into consideration a bit when you are querying for things. But honestly, record level security is really determined by the with sharing or without sharing clause in your Apex class that you're running. We're not going to go over that, but that's the most important factor when it comes to record level security. But using scope can help. So help filter things down a little bit more anyway, if you want to. All right, so now that we've gone over that, there's a couple of other little unique clauses that I just want to go over real quick. The first few are these for view, for reference, and for update. And these are pretty cool. And I feel like a lot of people, or maybe most people, don't know that these clauses exist. But you can use these for view clauses to actually update the last viewed by field or recently viewed, and add a record to a recently viewed list for users. So say for instance, you build a user interface or some kind of Lightning web component, kind of like this one I have here, that I made that's called the character counting component, where you can actually count the characters in a field. When a user views this component, I mean, they viewed the data, right? It's technically recently viewed data. And so if you wanted to have your query just automatically kind of update the, last viewed by, or last viewed date rather, and update the recently viewed list view for your user, then just using this for view clause will do that for you, which is like pretty awesome in my opinion. So, anytime you build a UI kind of similar to this one where you know they're viewing the data, I mean, consider using it because it's pretty useful. It, save you some time and some headache in some situations. For update is basically, it's very similar. So if you build something again like this, and it's more like this record edit form that I have, and you know that if somebody lands on this, they're probably going to update it, then you might want to use this for update clause in your SOQL query, which you can just kind of tack on to the end of your SOQL query. Both of these you just kind of tack on to the end. And what this does is it actually locks your record so that nobody else can edit it while you're editing it. And that gets you out of, record locking binds that you can get into when you start using, when you have a lot of users updating data in your system. The last one of these clauses is the for reference clause. And the for reference clause is probably the one that you're going to use the least of them all. But basically, you're supposed to use this when the only situation I've heard of this used in is when you are also displaying related records on a view, potentially in a UI, and you want the last reference date to be updated, and you want recently viewed data to be updated as well. I'll say it's rare you're going to use this, and if you do use it, just like it says here, you're probably going to use it in conjunction with the for view clause. But again, this is just saying, well, the user viewed a record, and they also referenced a bunch of related records, related to that viewed record. So let's update the fact that they took a look at those. So if you want to, that one's out there, but again, it's less commonly used. I've honestly never seen this one used. So, but it's good to know that it exists. So the last thing that I want to go over real quick before we get into the group by clause and the having clause and the aggregate functions, which are kind of going to do all together and are really important to know what they are, is this fields function that was somewhat recently added to the SOQL language. This fields function is a function that I honestly am going to suggest you use sparingly, if ever. But what it allows you to do is select all of the fields on your object, or a subset of all the fields on your object. So this, if you're coming over from another tech stack like or that uses SQL or SQL, right? This is the equivalent of select star. So it's cool that it exists now, but you normally don't really want to use select star very often, at least in my experience, and you don't really very often want to do this either. But in the case that you do, basically all you need to do to select all of your fields on an object is just say select fields all. If you want all the custom ones, you say select fields custom. And if you wanted all your standard fields, you say select field standard. So if we came over to the dev console and we wanted to get all of the fields on the account object, for instance, say, let's just limit this to maybe 50 records. And instead of this, we'd say fields all, like that. If we execute, you can see there's like a trillion fields that got returned here. But But there you go. There's all of our all of our fields returned and displayed to us, which is pretty cool to know exists. But like I said before, use it sparingly, because that slows down, your return results for your queries as well. And you really don't want to query for data that you do not need. So good to know exists, but use it with caution. Okay, the last two clauses that we're going to go over together before we get into actually using SOQL in Apex are the group by clause and the having clause. But before we actually go over them, we have to be aware of these things called aggregate functions. And the reason that we need to know about aggregate functions is because both the having by clause the having clause and the group by clause depend on you using these in your query, meaning that you can't use group by and you can't use having without using an aggregate function. And that's really important to know. If you try to go use one of these group bys or that having clause without an aggregate function, it's just not going to let you do it, more or less. So let's first take a look at these aggregate functions and figure out what they do. Basically, there are 5 aggregate functions. You have the ability to average a field, to count the amount of records based on a field, to take the minimum value of a field, the maximum value of a field, and the sum of all of the values in a field across the records that you are querying against. So let's take a look at this in the dev console. If we come in here and we do select, we'll say annual revenue again. Oops. Revenue. By the way, SOQL is not case sensitive at all. I know I've been capitalizing everything, but this technically also works as lowercase. I just like to capitalize it because I think it looks cleaner. It's more in line with what you'd see in other query languages out there in the world. Anyway, okay, so we've got our annual revenue, and maybe we want to see what the max value for our annual revenue is on our account records that have an annual revenue filled out. So where annual revenue is not equal to null, right? So basically what we're doing here is we're saying, I would like to find out what the max value is in the annual revenue field for all accounts where the annual revenue is actually filled out. And if we hit execute here, we can see that max annual revenue, and we can see that it's $5.6 billion. So that's pretty cool. If we just queried for annual revenue, all accounts that have annual revenue and not the max, we can see that that does indeed look to be the highest total annual revenue on any one account. And you can, of course, do any of the other ones. So maybe we want to see the average of our annual revenues across all those accounts which have annual revenue filled out. If we do that, we can see it comes up to, I don't know what that is, maybe like $1 billion or something. Yeah, $1.137 billion. And of course, you can do the minimum and the other options that you had there, the sum and the count. So if you counted this, you'd come back with 8 records, which, as we saw somewhere around here, maybe, we have 8 rows that have the annual revenue filled out. So you can see that it returned a count of 8 records. So pretty cool, these aggregate functions, and super important to know exist because they can be helpful at times when you're writing your code. Okay, so we know that these aggregate functions exist and what their purpose is. The next thing that we need to figure out is how we actually use group by, right? So let's check out group by and figure out what it means, basically. So when we use these aggregate functions, maybe we would like to group them by a particular field, right? And for instance, back over here where we've got our annual revenue, maybe we want the max annual revenue, but we want to potentially group it by another field on the account object. And I think there is an account type field. So let's take a shot at that and see what we get. Yeah, okay, cool. There is. So basically, what we're saying here, right? When we looked at max annual revenue before, we just got that $5.6 billion. But now what we're saying is we want to know the max annual revenue by our account type, essentially. And so we've got 2 rows returned to us now. One that says for our customer direct account type, the max annual revenue is $5.6 billion. And another row that says for our customer channel, our max annual revenue is, what is that, $950 million, I think. So this is a really cool way to group your aggregate function results together by a particular field. So that's more or less what the group by is and what it does. It can be very useful if you want to, group those aggregate results together in a particular format. It's kind of like when you group in reports. If you're very familiar with Salesforce reports, I'm not going to go over that too much, but grouping kind of gives you a lot of those reporting capabilities as well. And the last clause that we need to talk about is the halving clause. And the halving clause is basically a way to filter the results that aggregate functions return, as it states here. And essentially, right, when you have a where clause normally, you can't filter out by an aggregate function, right? But in our case, we want to, maybe, and that is where this halving clause comes in handy. So if we come back here to our aggregate query results that we just set up a moment ago, if we wanted to say only return, a max annual revenue of, greater than $950 million, I think is what that is, we could do a halving clause at the end of this that says halving max annual revenue of greater than 950,000,000, I think. And what we'll see returned is just 1 row instead of 2, because that other row had exactly 950,000 as its maximum revenue. And now what we've done is essentially filtered it out in our call here by saying we would like only to have accounts that have greater than a max annual revenue of $950 million. So this halving clause is just a way to use aggregate functions as a way to filter out even more data from your query. And if you can believe it, we are finally at a point where we need to start checking out how to actually use SOQL with Apex. So now that we know about all of the most important features of SOQL, we should take a look at using it in Apex and figuring out how that works, because there are some pretty cool things that you should know about. So let's go on ahead and make a class together, but in the spirit of never using the dev console because I don't love it. Actually, I say that and then I think, you know what, we're going to benchmark things. So let's just stick to the dev console for now. Because it's going to make it easier for us to benchmark stuff too. It's yet the only other thing that the dev console is really good at doing. So let's actually, in this dev console, create an Apex class. And I'll just call this Apex SOQL example or something like that. And for those of you that don't want to follow along in the dev console because it is an outdated nightmare, if you want to follow along in an IDE, you could most certainly do so. And let me pull up an IDE here. So we've got Visual Studio Code. If you don't know how to set up Visual Studio Code, I have tutorials going over all of the IDEs showing you how to set up, Visual Studio Code and IntelliJ to use for Salesforce. But basically what you're going to do is just hit Control-Shift-P to bring up what's called the command palette, and you type in create an Apex class, which you can see down here. And then you'll just click that, type in the name of your class, hit enter, and then you will be able to follow along in not the developer console. And that is what I would suggest you do for all of your development efforts. At the very least, you should use Visual Studio Code to do your development, or you could use IntelliJ, which is what IntelliJ and Illuminated Cloud 2, which is what I personally suggest because it is by far the best IDE out there in my opinion. For Salesforce anyway. So whatever you do, I'd say follow along in one of these IDEs instead of Developer Console, because I would never suggest developing in it. But for the purposes of what we're doing and the things I'm going to show you, we're going to stay right here in the Dev Console for now, which hurts my soul a little bit, but also it's good for a handful of things. All right, so let's go on ahead and write some code together. And we're going to create just a public static method that is going to return nothing. But let's see, we'll call this query for accounts. You can name your method whatever you'd like. If you're not familiar with how to write Apex at all, I have a whole introductory series over the basics of Apex, like methods and classes and variables and all that stuff. So go check it out. I've got a whole playlist for it called the Apex Masterclass or Beginner Apex Tutorials. Okay, so we're creating a method here, and we're just going to try to query for some accounts and figure out what we actually do with SOQL queries in Apex. So first things first, if I tried to just do what I've been doing in the query editor down here and start writing select, name from account where annual revenue is not equal to null, and it's going to complain about this because that doesn't make any sense in Apex like it does down here in the query editor. So you can already see there's a whole bunch of problems, and it's like, what the heck are you doing, man? Right? So let's figure out how to actually make this query run in Apex. The first thing that we will want to do is declare what is called a list. You could also use a map, and we'll go over a map in just a moment. But we're going to declare a list of type account, like so. And we will name it account list, and we will set it equal to this query right here. And you have to put your query in these brackets so that it knows to place this query in a list, in this list essentially. So you're going to put this query in these brackets and then just write your query like you normally would. And what this is going to end up doing is it's going to go out and query the database for our records, and it's going to just place all of these records that it finds into this list of accounts for us, which is really nice. Much simpler than a lot of tech stacks you would work with, where you'd have to actually go out and connect to your database and do a whole bunch more to retrieve your data. In Salesforce, you just have to do this inline select statement, which is really, really convenient. And as you can already see, for those of you that come from other tech stacks, I have not made this account object representation myself. Salesforce, when you create custom objects or for existing standard objects, just automatically creates this wrapper for you, this account wrapper for you. So it's really, really cool. Okay, so we've got our SOQL query set up and we are assigning it to a list. Let's run this and see what we get. We're going to just output this, this list into a debug log. Oops. For now. And yeah, so we will save this. And what we'll do to run this code is open up what's called the Execute Anonymous window. And you do that by going to debug, and then there's Execute Anonymous window in that debug dropdown. And what we're going to do is, I've got to remind myself what I named this class, Apex SOQL example dot query for accounts. And we are going to hit the execute button to run it. And when it runs, we are going to get a debug log generated for us over here in the logs panel. And you can see that we did indeed get 8 rows returned to us for our list, just like we have been when we were using the query editor. And we can see that we got that list of accounts filled out with all of the information that we asked it to be filled out with, which is awesome. So when you're querying for data, this is exactly how you're going to do it. You can also set this up using a map like so. If you'd prefer to just query directly into a map, and you can do that by saying new map, ID, account, and then doing your query directly in here. Just grab this and drop it right in there, like so. And this will return to you a map of your accounts with the ID as the key. I'm going to go ahead and put the ID in there. Otherwise, I might get myself into trouble. Technically, it always queries for ID in the background. So you don't ever actually have to put ID in here, but I'm not a fan of not doing that. It's confusing to people that don't know that that's a thing. So I'm going to save that, and then we're just going to prove that this outputs in the map and run it. So we'll execute our last execute anonymous statement, and hopefully that ran. Oh, there it goes. And we can see from our debug statements when they load that we did indeed get a map output for us, which is cool. All right, so the only other thing that is really, really important to know before we get into a little bit more advanced area of SOQL querying in Apex and benchmarking things is that you're going to often need to take a variable that you've declared in Apex and use it in your query here. And it's great because you can just kind of do this inline. It's really, really quite simple, but you have to use what are called bind variables. So for instance, if we wanted to say, create an integer of our minimum annual revenue or something, and set it equal to, I don't know, 5,000. And we wanted to say, you know, where our annual revenue is greater than this minimum annual revenue, then we can do that. But what we have to do is put a colon and then put our variable in there. And this is called bind variables or variable binding or whatever. And what this allows us to do is essentially just place this integer variable directly into our query and have it run just like it has been. And hopefully when I save this, my problems go away here. I haven't forgot something silly, which I maybe did. Oh, yep, it's because I can't spell. Now if I save this, it should work. And yeah, so if we, actually let me grab this here too, add it in my map. And so now if we save this, basically what we should get is all accounts where the annual revenue is greater than 5,000, which is, you know, the 8 accounts again. But if we execute our anonymous Apex again, maybe so slow someday, we should see that work out a-okay. And we do. So it looks like one of them actually, no, we still got 8 results. So we're good. So yeah, and that's how you'll use variables in your queries. What you'll find yourself using bind variables for more often than not are actually those in clauses that we talked about a while ago. So I'm just going to show you real quick how to use that. It's really not much different than what we already did, but let's just create a set of data and we'll call it account types and set it equal to a new set of strings. And then we'll put some strings in here once I figure out what the names of the account types are. Customer channel or customer direct. Oof. Dev console is struggling right now. And customer channel. So now we've got this new set of strings, and maybe we want to say we only want to select accounts where the type, is in, let's remove this whole situation here. We'll say the type, the type is in the account types set, like so. And you can just do that and it will work. And we'll go ahead and copy this into our map so that gives us the results in this debug. And we will save that. And if we run it, we should get a good old-fashioned list of results. Execute our last anonymous Apex. And yeah, so we got 10 rows returned that were of one of those account types. So pretty cool. All right, and like I said, that's probably one of the most popular places that you're going to use a bind variables in an in clause. So I really want to make sure that I showed that to you. Now, it's probably time to get into some more advanced SOQL querying in Apex. And so what we're going to do is actually go over what's called, that's at least what I refer to it as, pretty sure it's called Dynamic SOQL. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to produce a string, right? And that string could be built from who knows what. It could be built from custom metadata or a field set or any number of things out there that you can think of. And what we're going to do is build a string that we can use to query for data in Apex. So let's check that out. We'll make another method and we'll call it public static void dynamic account query, like so. And so basically what we're going to do is we're just going to declare a string. And I'm going to call this string a query to make it easy. And we're essentially just going to say, select ID name from account where type in account type. And you can indeed still use bind variables even in this string, which is pretty cool. I need to bring account types down here, and then I need to update my string to use the right name for the variable. Like so. So now we've got this query string, and you can construct this query string however you want, like I said, right? Instead of it having to be kind of hard typed like we have here, you can construct this from tons of different things. So you can kind of dynamically generate a query through a string. And what we're going to end up doing is saying, a list of accounts, account list is equal to database.query, and pass in our query string that we've written. Let's make this more obvious. We'll call this query string to not confuse you. And so basically what this is going to do is now we can take this string that we can build, on the fly based on who knows what, criteria, and we can use the database class to actually query for this data using that string. And, if we debug this, we should get the same results that we did before, which was like 10 records. So let's go to our execute anonymous window, and instead of query for accounts, we'll call dynamic account query, which I hope is what I call this, and it is. Oof. Dev console. It's scaring me. I think it's going to crash any second here. Okay. And so we ran that successfully without any issues, and it should bring us back 10 results, which it did. And, this is unbelievably useful, this dynamic querying, because you can do some really, really awesome stuff with it. And you can still use bind variables as you've seen here. You just, it's the exact same syntax. It's super easy. You just put that little colon in front of your variable, and it will pick that up in database.query and bind it just like it normally would in an inline query like you see here. So just wanted to let you all know that this functionality does exist, and it's extremely powerful when you want to build some, really dynamic code. The one downside to this is that you're building this using a string. So, I don't know if you've ever clicked the where is this used button or tried to delete something and it told you you can't delete it because the field was referenced in an Apex class or something. When you use dynamic SOQL like this, it will not tell you that you're using that field in a SOQL query in one of your Apex classes. So that is the one downside to dynamic SOQL, but in general, it's still extremely useful and yeah, shouldn't be overlooked in my opinion. Okay, so yeah, now that we have done that, I think it's time to go over benchmarking and using what's called the query plan tool so that you can really figure out if your queries are efficient, effective, and if they're going to perform well on huge sets of data. Okay, before we get into the query plan tool, the first thing I want to show you how to do is kind of benchmark how long your SOQL query is taking. It's really easy to do. It's pretty simple, but there's so much conflicting weird information out there in the Salesforce docs about what contributes to Apex CPU timeouts and whether or not querying for data against the database using a SOQL query actually contributes to the CPU time limit. And so I want to show you guys how you can prove exactly how long it's taking to query for your data and explain a handful of more, I guess, semi-advanced things that you should know about. Okay, so the first thing is, if you read the documentation that Salesforce has provided, it's extremely confusing as to whether or not a SOQL query actually counts against your Apex CPU time limit of 10 seconds per Apex, code execution transaction, right? According to them, when they are reaching into the database for your SOQL query and retrieving your data, that period of time where they're reaching in and retrieving your data does not count against your Apex CPU time limit. But that's a little misleading because reaching in and grabbing the data is just one step here. As you can see, when you're using a SOQL query in Apex, you're always going to be assigning it typically to a list or a map. And to do that, it requires them to take that data it retrieved from the database and wrap it into a representation of an account for your Apex code to be able to use. And that takes a good amount of time, and that does add to your CPU time limit. And this is one of the most time-intensive operations that your code is going to run into, unless you just have really, poorly written code in general. So, if we take a look at this, there is a really easy way to kind of benchmark how long your queries are taking in actual seconds in your dev console. This is not so easy in IDEs, unfortunately, but the dev console still has this really cool thing that allows you to figure this out pretty quick and actually visualize it. But we'll also set some debug logs too to make it even easier. So I'm just going to drop a couple things here to make this easier to look at. We're going to just take a look at this. Actually, let me leave this in here so that you guys can look at this code in a repo after I create this video. And instead, we'll create another method down here, and we'll call it, I don't know, query benchmarking example or something. And what we'll do is we'll create a list of accounts again. I'm just going to grab the same old setup that we got. Actually, no, I won't. I've got a different idea here. So we've got account list is equal to, we're just going to first query for all of our accounts. Select ID name from account. And then we'll just loop over our accounts just to see how long each of these operations take. right? So we'll say list count list, and all we're going to do is just say count.name is equal to Bob or something. And let's take a look at how long each of these operations takes. So we're going to make a system debug and take a look at the limits class and say get apex, get CPU time. So we'll start this with CPU time 1. And then we will do another CPU time 2 after we query. And we'll do another after this for loop here. Oh boy. CPU time 3. So we can see about how long this is going to take us to execute. And, oh, I forgot plus signs. Those are important. So once this saves, I will go back to debug, execute anonymous window, and I'll call this method instead. Query benchmarking example. And we are going to, just hit execute. And once this executes, we're going to be able to see immediately, right? Okay, originally we were at 5 milliseconds. And now after that query, we're at 32 milliseconds. And now after that loop, where we looped through 2,458 rows, we're at 78 milliseconds. And you can see, you know, that SOQL query took a decent amount of time. You know, it took 27 milliseconds to finish its operation, which is not a small amount, you know, when things start to add up anyway. But you can also see that if we said like where annual, or actually let's say where name is equal to taco, for instance, we save that. And if we ran this one more time, we'll see that that should take a considerably smaller amount of time, right? So we went from 27 milliseconds down to just 8 milliseconds. So pretty quick in comparison. So you can see that, you know, the size of the data set that you're querying does have a pretty significant impact on the time it takes for your code to execute. And you can see that in even more detail if you go to your log. So you have to open up one of your logs first, and you can go to debug, and you can either click this view log panels, or you can do switch perspective to do analysis. I'm going to do view log panels though, and just get the, I can't remember, it's execution overview. Yeah, there we go. And see this execution overview. And what this will allow me to do is take a look at the time it took for each operation. And so this is just, you know, calling the method, that time frame. This is the actual grabbing data from the database and giving it to our list time frame. And this is iterating over our for loop to of data, right? So if you click on each of those, it shows you in your code, in your debug log, exactly what's, you know, causing that little chunk of time there in that block. And you can see that's from the SOQL statement. If I clicked on this, you could see that this is line 21, I believe, is where the loop starts. Yeah, basically right after the CPU time. So yeah, it's a pretty cool little log analyzer, and it'll allow you to kind of break down exactly how long your SOQL queries are taking in comparison to the rest of your code. So pretty cool to know about. So the next thing that we should go over is what's called the query plan tool. And most of you out there, even if you're advanced developers or intermediate developers, have maybe never even heard of this query plan tool thing. And that's okay. That just means that you've never got yourself into a selectivity limit in Salesforce, which I've got to tell you, I've run into twice, and they are some of the most horrifying things that you can do or get yourself into. Because basically what happens is your table, your object in Salesforce grows so big, as in it is now storing, millions of records in it or hundreds of thousands of records in it. And you or someone else in the past has written a SOQL query that is not selective enough. And what that ends up resulting in is all of your queries that are not selective enough after that table grows to a certain amount of records just outright fail. And it's a nightmare to get yourself into. So I'm here to tell you how to prevent it. If you're in that situation right now, I'm here to tell you how to get out of it. And the best way to get out of it is by using the query plan tool, at least in my opinion, because it's going to help you figure out how to make your query much more selective and tell you what's wrong with your query in the first place. So to figure out how to use to find out how to use the query plan tool, or just to use it in general, first we have to go over to the query editor. And more than likely, this query plan button down here in the bottom is not there for you. And if it's not, then you'll go up here to help, click on preferences, and turn this enable query plan to true. And once that's to true, what we can do is write a query like so, and then hit the query plan button. And the query plan button is going to pull up this kind of table of information, and it's going to list all of the different options that Salesforce has based on your query to query for your fields, right? Right now, the only way that Salesforce can query for your data is using a table scan, which is basically the last thing that you want to see in this leading operation type field, because this is the worst situation you can get yourself into. So let me break everything down a little bit for you here, because this is a little bit confusing. First things first, if you know nothing about database indexing or indexing in general, I would love to go over it, but it's a little bit of a complex concept that would only serve to confuse you even more in this video. What you need to know is indexing makes your queries go super fast. And using an indexed field can help you create really fast queries. If you want to know more about indexing, I'll put some stuff in the description, some links to some materials that will tell you more about the inner workings of indexing and all there is to know about it. But basically, what you're going to want to do is find a field over here in Salesforce that's indexed, and hopefully be able to filter your queries using where clauses with one of these index fields. And we'll go over that more in just a second too. So let's come back over here and go over this query plan tool first though. So there's a bunch of stuff here. The first thing is cardinality. Cardinality and S-object cardinality, to my knowledge, are basically the same thing. And what they are the approximate amount of records in the table that you are querying. So for me, that's 2,458 records on the account object table, or in the account object. The cost here is the cost of your query using this query operation type called table scan. What you want to see is a query cost below 1. If this is higher than 1, your query is going to fail once you hit selectivity limits. So if you're putting in a query and this cost is above 1, you've got a problem. So let's see, right now I have no where clause here, and we're resulting in a table scan, which basically that just means that I am scanning all of the records in the entirety of my table to get a result. Let's see, if we can use, get this leading operation type to be index or other. And let me just bring over really quick the cheat sheet here. That leading operation type can be one of 4 things. It can be index, like we've been talking about. It will use an indexed field to query the object. Sharing, which is maybe your 3rd best option typically, which will use an index based on sharing rules to determine or to speed up your query, basically. Table scan, which is your worst option, which will result in you scanning all the records for your queried object. And then other, which is basically the same as indexed, and I think, but we're using internal fields that are indexed by Salesforce, or standard fields typically that have been indexed by Salesforce is when you'll see other pop up. So how do we figure out what fields are indexed? We kind of went over that, but if you go over to the object manager and you start looking at your fields, you'll see this indexed indicator over here in a check mark. If there's a check mark next to your field, then it is indexed. And what that means is if you use it to filter on, you're going to typically have a pretty fast query. So we come back over here to our query and we maybe use the name field to filter our query on. You can see that the name field was indexed, right? Then we should see a much faster time or cost, and you can see that that cost is crazy fast, right? It's 0.004 as compared to 2.8 something. And you can see that the leading operation type is other, and I'm pretty sure it's other because this is a standard field that Salesforce provides that is indexed. And you can see that the field that it's using for that index is the name field, right? And then it's going to show you its other options for potentially querying for records. You can still see that there's an operation type of table scan that takes much longer than this one. But this one that shows up at the top here in the query plan tool is the one that Salesforce is just going to automatically select in the background when it executes your SOQL query. And so you want this top one to be under a value of 1, which this one is, which is great. And you're always going to see this ridiculous note down here. It never goes away. Doesn't matter what object you're on. So just know that this always shows up, and don't worry about it. Okay, so that's basically how you're going to use the query plan tool to figure out how to create more selective queries to get you faster runtimes on your queries and to make sure that they abide by all selectivity-based limits in Salesforce. Now, the next couple things we're just going to briefly go over, which are actually, before we go over them, I should go over one other thing. I'm going to put this cheat sheet in the description of the video so you have it too. When you're using this query plan tool and when you're building your queries, there is basically nothing I've found that is more useful than this query and search optimization cheat sheet. And basically this tells you all about index selectivity thresholds, and it tells you about the limits around those index selectivity thresholds, and it also tells you index selectivity exceptions where if you use certain filters with certain conditions, you can essentially, even if you use an index field, result in it a query not being indexed. So this is extremely, extremely useful. And I'll have this in the description. You can check it out. And I would suggest consulting it when you're building your queries if you are even remotely concerned that they may not be selective enough. Okay, with that said, now we're going to go over briefly two really, really advanced areas of SOQL, two that you will probably not see yourself get into very much, but we're going to go over SOQL for big objects, and then we're going to go over just briefly async SOQL and what it is, how you can use it, and when you can use it. All right, so big objects. Let's go over the many limitations of doing SOQL queries on big objects. If you never had to use a big object, I guess you can kind of consider yourself lucky. They're quite a bit more difficult to deal with, although they have their benefits and they're kind of useful if you're going to be archiving data. But big objects, you know, they have an enormous amount of limitations with SOQL, and I just wanted you to be aware of them. So you can run SOQL queries on big objects, but there's a bunch of things that you cannot do, like you can't use multiple in clauses, which I think this goes over somewhere down here. Yeah, you can't use multiple in clauses. You also can't do a whole bunch of other things. You can't use the not equals, like, not in, excludes, includes, or aggregate functions. So you can't use, you know, group by or having or anything like that. You don't want to retrieve the ID field in a big object query. So there's just some uniqueness around big objects that make them difficult to query at times. And it's really important to know, you know, if you are working with big objects, everything I've talked to you about is not always true. For those of you that are looking at this and thinking, what's a big object? Don't worry about it then. You know, you're not working with them. But if you ever do, just know big objects are, SOQL is hampered quite a bit when you use big objects. That said, when you're using big objects, as it states right here on the last line, if you want to perform these operations not allowed with SOQL, then you can use async SOQL instead, which leads us to async SOQL. And async SOQL basically allows you to query for quite a bit more data than normal. So it allows you to query for up to 1 million records. But there are some downsides to async SOQL. This is pretty cool if you have a really unique case where you can wait for your query data to get returned to you and you don't need it returned to you in real time. There are certainly situations in which that can be useful. But the downside is, number one, there's no way to just outright do this in Apex. You actually have to integrate with the async SOQL REST API to get this done. You can't just write an inline SOQL statement like you can with regular SOQL. But this can be useful if you're using big objects, and it can be useful if you need to query for enormous sets of data for one reason or another. So when you get into really big orgs or into orgs that use a lot of big objects, just know async SOQL could potentially be your friend, but you do actually have to write the integration yourself. To my knowledge at this point in time, you can't just inline async SOQL. So pretty cool, pretty useful in certain situations, not necessarily in Apex. You could get yourself into heap size limits or other problems if you're querying for that much data. But it's good to know it exists because you have another option here to grab gigantic chunks of data if you'd like to. I'm not going to go over these options too much more, but I just did want you to know they existed, and primarily I wanted you to know about both of these things for big objects because, you know, a lot of us out there will get into the big object game at one point in time, and these are useful if you're using big objects. All right, I think that wraps up SOQL. Now, there are things I didn't go over in SOQL that you can certainly still take a look at, like location-based SOQL queries, where you can actually figure out the distance between, you know, one account or the other, as long as they have addresses filled out and latitude, longitude filled out, which you can automatically fill out. And there's a handful of other things in here that you can do with SOQL queries that are rare, you know, situations that you'll get into. But I think we've covered the vast majority of SOQL, what you can do with it, how you use it in Apex, how you can kind of benchmark your SOQL, and things you should be aware of if you're using SOQL with big objects. So now that all of the SOQL fun is done, we're still not done. Now we've got to go over SOSL. All right, so we have finished up with learning about SOQL, but we have yet to learn about SOSL, the other query language in Salesforce. SOSL is probably not going to take us anywhere near as long to learn as SOQL, mostly because a lot of the things translate to SOSL, but SOSL is quite a bit different. There's a handful of things you need to know about it. So you can actually write the queries in the first place because they are different structures than SOQL. That said, let's first figure out what SOSL is. So as it states right here in front of us, SOSL is a Salesforce object search language. And you're going to use SOSL in search-based situations. For instance, I've used it for custom search bars, and things along those lines. Any time that you want to do a query across multiple fields on multiple objects for a string of text, this is your best path forward. SOSL allows you to do some pretty cool stuff with searching, and you know, search-based situations in your development are primarily when you're actually going to use it. So it is rare, I would say, that you're going to run into situations in which you will want to use SOSL. It is not a super commonly used language, but it is extremely useful in those searching-based situations and those customization situations for searches that you can get yourself into. So it is very useful to have in your toolbox when you start doing that, because SOQL is not so great searching across multiple text fields. It just simply isn't, and it doesn't really do a good job when you want to search for a particular string across a lot of fields on potentially a lot of objects. And SOSL is really good at that. Now, the downside of SOSL is that it can only return a maximum of 2,000 records, which is not a lot of records, especially in large orgs. So you can hit that limit really fast, and unlike SOQL, which can return up to 50,000 records, 2,000 is way lower, right? Okay, so that's kind of the basics of SOSL. When you would want to use it over SOQL, you're gonna see it sparsely used in the Salesforce world, but you will see it from time to time, and you should consider using it from time to time in very specific situations. So let's go over how to actually build a SOSL query together in the query builder, the good old query builder, since that has been our life for the last however many hours it's been now. All right, so I've got the query builder open, and what we're going to do is just build a really simple SOSL query together. And yes, the query editor does support both SOQL and SOSL, as it kind of says right here. So let's create a query together. All right, so the first thing that we're going to do is write find, because that's how you're going to start all of your SOSL queries. You're going to start it with the keyword or the clause find. And then you're going to put curly braces. And inside of these curly braces, you are going to put your search term or search terms. So for instance, maybe I want to find the search term taco, which has been like half this video at this point. And you want to find this in the name fields. And you want, sorry, let me explain this a little bit. So what we're doing is we're trying to find this keyword taco, so this string taco, in any of the name fields. And this is where it gets a little a little confusing. And it says returning. So basically what we're saying is we want to search the name fields on the account object, and we want, when we search on that account object, we want the name field to be returned to us, the data in the name field to be returned to us. So let's kind of read this query together. It's very confusing, and you can see it's in a different format than SOQL was. So, okay, what we're saying is we would like to find the string taco in any name field on the account object. And when and if we find a string of taco on the account object and on one of its records, we would like the records to return the data in the name field to display to us. So if we hit execute on this now, what you're going to see is search results in a tab, and you can see that any account that had taco in its name field was returned. So we've got extra taco, taco, and Taco Bell. The three accounts we've been working with quite a bit throughout this entire tutorial. But a cool thing about this is we can actually query on multiple objects. So maybe we wanted to also check the contact object, like so. Then we can do that. And now what we're saying is we'd like to find the string taco in any of the name fields on the account object or the contact object. And on the account object, I would like to return data in a list with the name field. And on the contact object, I would like to have the data returned to me for first name. So if I hit execute on this, you can now see that two tabs pop up, right? One for the account object, and we've got the same, taco accounts as before. And then one for the contact object, where we pulled back the first name, which was batchable. I'm guessing the last name was probably taco, or one of the name fields on contact had taco in it. We can actually just take a look at name and see. And yeah, it looks like the last name on that contact had taco in it. So you can see that this find mechanism actually kind of works like the like operator in SOQL, right? It's kind of a wildcard term. It's not an exact match, right? The account name didn't have to just be taco. It just had to have the word taco in it, right? And same thing for contact. The whole name didn't have to be taco. It just had to have the term taco in it, which is pretty cool. Now, before we get into all the other nuances of SOSL, the thing that I want to go over and kind of highlight the most is this in clause here, in name fields. Let me bring up the, kind of guide that they have for you here. About in clauses, let me refresh this, it's kind of broken. There we go. So for this in clause, you only have a few options available for you, which is a little frustrating in my opinion, but it's still workable. It's still useful either way. And so basically unlike in SOQL, where you say, you want to take a look at particular fields and you list them out, right? Instead, in SOSL, what you're going to say is you want to search for this term in a predefined group of fields. And those predefined group of fields can either be all fields, which allows you to search on all searchable fields for that, for SOSL queries. You can search on all email fields. So that's just all fields that are of type email. All name fields, and all the name fields are listed here. I'm not going to go over all of them, but you can see that there's quite a number of name fields across the different objects. Phone fields, where you'll only search against phone number fields, and sidebar fields. And this sidebar fields is one I want to talk about because it's confusing and doesn't really make a lot of sense. I'm not sure why they're called sidebar fields. But basically, these are any indexed fields on your object. So any fields that are indexed are what are going to end up in these sidebar fields. And we talked about earlier how you can see indexed fields. If you go to your fields in Object Manager, any of the ones with this checkbox here in the indexed column are indexed fields. So it's important to note that you can only pick from one of those 5 search groups. You can't deviate from that, really. So and it's still very useful. It's just, you're limited in a different way. So if I wanted to search on all fields here, I would just type in all fields, hit execute. You can see we got one new account in here because one new field actually had taco written to it. I'm not sure which field it is, but it had taco written to it. So it's pretty cool. All right, so the other things that we should go over are all the same kind of things that we went over with SOQL, like limits and offsets and order by and all that kind of stuff. And we'll also go over some more nuances for this returning clause here and the find clause and what you can place inside of these curly brackets. But first, let's go over the easy stuff so we can get it out of the way. So in this returning clause, you can see that we are returning results for the account object and the contact object. And we're asking for the name field value for both of them. But we could also ask for any other fields, just like we did in a SOQL query. We could say, ID field, name field, annual revenue field. And we can also say things like where name is equal to taco, like so, and you can put a limit of 100 on it, and you can offset it by 100. So you can see inside of this kind of these parentheses here that we have that this kind of works like a SOQL query, aside from the fact that you don't have to say select in the beginning of it, and you don't have to say from the account object, right? Because we already know in this instance that we're querying on the account object. So this works, this kind of query inside of this parentheses here for each object that you end up searching on works very similar to a SOQL query, aside from the fact that you're never going to put a from, and aside from the fact that you're not going to put a select at the beginning. You'll still be able to use where clauses to start limiting what gets returned in here. You can use limits, you can use offsets, and you can use order bys. So, if you wanted to order by name, you could do that, right? And if we hit execute, I think I need to put order by name before these. 1 second. I need to put order by name over here, not before or not after my limit in my offset. And that's important to note. I can't use offset in a multi-object search. So that's what it's telling me here is you can't use offset when you're searching across multiple entities or multiple objects. So now if I run this, see how often I use SOSL. I haven't remembered or memorized all of the limits there. Anyway, so now you can see this kind of we added data that we got returned for us, and we stripped out some data that we don't care about with that where clause there to filter out our data. So pretty cool, right? These, essentially act as queries inside of each of these objects that you're having or you're wanting to have results returned from, which allows you to further kind of narrow down your results for each one of these objects. And it's just as important to narrow these down to the best of your ability in SOSL as it is in SOQL. So if you can narrow them down, definitely do. The next thing we should go over is this find clause and the many things that you can do with this, right? Because there's a lot that you can do with it, and it's an interesting beast, I'd say. So let's go over it. If you take a look at the docs, what you can do are, well, quite frankly, a lot of things. So in this find clause where we put in our search query, or our search term, we can do a bunch of things. We can use wildcards, kind of like we did with the operator in SOQL, but the wildcards are different characters. Instead of a % and an underscore, instead for the % we have an asterisk, and for the underscore we have a question mark. So for instance, if I came back over here and put a star at the end of taco and we executed this, you'd see a handful of new things came up because maybe, I don't know, maybe there were some other things that it didn't match on that had the word taco in it, and now those are popping up. Or maybe I use the question mark, and the question mark is basically just a wildcard for a single character. And if I hit execute on this, you can see that it pulled up 4 results here, but it didn't pull up any results on the contact all of a sudden. It went away. And I've noticed over time that when you use this particular wildcard along with a whole bunch of other things that we're going to go over here in just a second, that it gets more specific. So for instance, before it matched taco on tacos, basically. Those are the 3 contacts we got. And we got them back because of the word tacos in the name. Tacos. But when we add this single wildcard here, this single character wildcard, it started matching on exactly the words or the letters that we have here. T, a wildcard of any character, and then CO. And if we have the Z on the end, then it doesn't match anymore. So that's why all of a sudden we're not getting the contact matches, is because the behind the scenes search engine is saying, okay, now we've got to match on exactly these 4 characters, not these 4 characters plus a Z at the end. And you'll notice that same thing, you can set that up, and if you put this word in quotation marks, you'll have that same outcome where you only get 4 accounts again, and you don't get that tacos setup that you had before. Additionally, with this find clause, you can do things like taco or batchable. And you can kind of chain these, right? And you could also do taco or batchable and tacos or something like that, right? And you don't actually have to put quotes around these. That's not necessary. You can if you'd like to. We'll go over what the quotes do in just a minute. But I will say, let's just drop a couple things here. If we have taco or batch, based on our original run of just taco, you'd think that we would get back, 4 accounts and 3 contacts. But what you're going to see here is when I say taco or batch, like so, which means that our string fields could have the word taco, the word taco or the word batch in them. What you're going to see is all of a sudden those 3 contacts disappear again. And that is because for some reason behind the scenes it's now matching exactly on these 4 characters and exactly on these 5 characters. So you have to have this exact word in it now instead of kind of that, generic match that we had before. So as soon as you deviate and use more than one term, basically it starts matching exactly, whereas if you just use one term, it kind of works in a bit of a different way. So if I change this to say taco or tacos, then all of a sudden we've got our contacts back that we had before, right? You can also, like I said before, use the keyword and what this would do is it would only return results where taco and tacos were present, which are none of them. So for our purposes, nothing got returned. You can also do nested statements. So you could say taco or tacos and batchable, like so. And then we get back our batchable tacos and our 4 tacos over here. Man, I think I've said tacos about 1 million times in this. Okay, so it's really important to know that you can do these things. You can match on multiple terms, but as soon as you deviate from that first search term and you start getting more complicated in here, the matching system behind the scenes kind of shakes things up a little bit, I guess, and changes things up. Now, sorry. So when you use quotation marks, like so, this is really beneficial when you have kind of like spaces in between your words and you want to match on specific words. So for instance, if I wanted this to match on the term Taco Bell, then you'd put it in quotes so that you can match on the term Taco Bell. And then we would only get Taco Bell back, right, for our account here. Which is cool, right? So anytime you have spaces in your search terms and you want to make sure that you find items in that order, taco and then bell, then make sure to wrap them in quotes. Otherwise, it's not really necessary to wrap them in quotes. You could, it's totally up to you, but it's not actually required. The only other thing that you can do within this find clause here is that you can also say and not. So it has the term tacos and it does not have the term batchable, basically. So if we ran that, we're going to end up with a bunch of accounts, and we're not going to end up with any contacts because the contacts all had tacos and batchable in them. Okay, so we've gone over our find clause. We've gone over our this in clause, all the fields that we can do. And we've gone over returning and what you can do with returning. Now, there's a handful of other kind of interesting, useful things that you can do in SOSL that I'd just like to briefly go over. The first one is this toLabel. If you use Translation Workbench at all, this is super useful. It will allow you to have your results returned translated, or the data returned to you translated. So, if you use Translation Workbench, this can come in a lot of handy. Definitely check that out. Another thing that you can do is USING Listview, which is actually pretty cool and can be useful in some situations. So if you wanted, for instance, the data for your account object or your contact object to only come from a particular list view, you can denote that by using this USING clause in your inside of your parentheses for your specific object query, like we just took a look at a little bit ago. And the other one that is pretty cool is spell correction. So you can, by default, spell correction is actually turned on. So if you wanted to match on something and it finds out that it's spelled wrong, it's still going to go out there and say, all right, well, this was probably spelled wrong, so we should match on it. You can turn this off too if you wanted to, so that it did not match on spell correction, and that's pretty cool as well. Now, there's a handful of other things you can see that you can do with SOSL, like highlight SOSL terms when they come out of your search results, include metadata with your SOSL terms, do things around networks, which are your Experience Cloud sites, among other things. But you'll find that you won't do those very often, and so we're not going to go over absolutely everything that there is to know about SOSL, because quite frankly, what you've just seen is what you're going to use 99% of the time. And yeah, the next thing that we need to do, now that we know how to structure a SOSL query, how it works, how we can, query over multiple objects, is we need to figure out how we can actually use this in Apex, right? Because as you could imagine, using this in Apex is quite a bit different than a SOQL query. So let's go check that out. All right, so we're back over here in the dev console, and we are just going to write some code together. Now that we've figured out how to kind of structure SOSL, let's figure out how we use it in code. So I've just created this class called Apex SOSL Example to help speed things up a little bit. And I'm going to create a new public static void method that I am going to call, I don't know, SOSL Example, because why not? And what we're going to do in here is actually make a SOSL call. So we're going to say a list of S object. And you might be looking at this and saying, what? And I totally understand that. So let me explain it before I even add the query in here. When we query for using SOSL, we don't have one specific object returned to us. Instead, we have a list of objects. So we're getting accounts returned, and we're getting contacts returned, and we're getting a whole bunch of records for both. So what we need to capture SOSL results is a list of S objects. Because we're capturing, multiple object results with SOSL, as we saw with those multiple tabs when we ran this query earlier. This one earlier, we can see that we have multiple tabs, one for each object, and that's how you would represent that here in the code. So if we write a query together, we'll just say find taco. And here in these SOSL queries for Apex, you are going to have to wrap your search term in single quotes like so. In all fields, returning account ID and name. I'm going to drop this down so it's easier to read. And contact ID and name, like so. And hopefully I have not forgotten anything. Totally possible. Let's save it and see what happens. Okay, so we're all good. Now we've got our list of S objects, and we've got our SOSL query assigned to it. And basically what this is going to return, let's just let's just run it and see what it returns. SOSL results like so. And if we go to debug and open execute anonymous window, we can do Apex SOSL example and then call our SOSL example method and execute it. If we execute it and we come over here to the logs, we can see that we output a list of accounts and a list of contacts, which is cool. So the question would next be, how do we actually iterate over this? Which, would be a great question to ask. So basically what we're going to end up doing is we need a for loop. And inside of our for loop, we are going to say, list of S object list SOSL results, and then within here we're going to say for S object list like so. And then we would output our object. Like so. So make sure I didn't do anything crazy here. And I didn't, so that's good. I always love it in Dev Console when they tell you you've got problems, and you really don't. And so we've saved this, and now if we run our execute anonymous again, we should be able to see our individual records that get output, which we can, right? extra taco, Taco Bell, new account, Batchable Tacos, Batchable Tacos, Batchable Tacos. Taco. I'm going crazy at this point. Okay, so that's kind of how you get your list of results and how you output or iterate over that list of results. The other thing that we should go over is, just like in SOQL, there is Dynamic SOSL. And we can build it in a very similar way, but we call a different method to use Dynamic SOSL. So let's check that out. And so basically, just like with SOQL, we're going to create a string that is named, we'll call it query string. And then we'll just put the exact same query in here to make our lives easier. Oops. We're going to have to escape these characters in here, single quotes. And I need to put this string all on the same line. Okay, so now we've got our Dynamic SOSL that is in string form. And now what we need to do is actually query for it, right? And so the way that we query for it is we are going to, of course, declare a list of S objects again. But then we're also going to say search.query, and we will send in our query string like so. And if I grab this for loop, we'll be able to see that this results in the same outcome as before. So let's open our execute anonymous window and call the Dynamic SOSL example. I have apparently spelled it wrong. Yeah, I definitely spelled it wrong. And yeah, so you can see we got the same results as before, but we just did it through Dynamic SOSL instead of that inline SOSL. And this has the same benefits as Dynamic SOQL, in that you could build this and and have it be fed from custom metadata, or I don't know, whatever else, right? There's a bunch of ways that you could use Dynamic SOSL to really give you some really flexible code, right? Instead of having this kind of inline SOSL that we see here. So let's see. I hope. Actually, I'm wrong. There's one last thing that I need to go over with you guys that is important that I haven't gone over for either SOQL or SOSL. And it's the last thing, and then we're done, I hope. And that is what's called SOSL and SOQL injection. And it's really important to, not take this lightly, and make sure that you always protect yourself against it. So in either SOQL or SOSL, you can use bind variables. I didn't show you that in SOSL, but you can use bind variables for SOSL too. So for instance, we have, if we wanted string search term like so is equal to taco, then I could use a bind variable within SOSL as well. And you can also do that in Dynamic SOSL, just like in Dynamic SOQL. But what happens very often is that you are asking for, in some custom UI you've built, for the user to fill out some information. And then the user fills out some information, and what you end up doing is using those bind variables in a bunch of dangerous ways, basically. So the user fills out all those fields, they send them into your Apex controller, and in your Apex controller, you are using those things that they filled out in their form inside of your queries. And if you're not careful, a malicious user, if you set things up that way, can start to attempt to query for more than they should be able to query for, right? Maybe some new fields that they weren't supposed to be querying for or whatever else. And so to protect yourself against malicious user input when you're using these bind variables in your SOQL and SOSL queries, what you need to make sure to do is when these are coming in from outside sources, like this I'm declaring this variable right here, so it's not really a big deal. But if it was coming in from an outside source, say I was having it passed in and I had a string search term passed in, right, like so, then what I'd really want to do is create a string of escaped search term and set it equal to string dot escape single quotes and put in my search term here, like so. And then essentially what I've done is now I can use this search term in here, and I don't have any fear of this external user who's sending me in the search term trying to be malicious and search on more terms than they should, or search in ways that I'm not anticipating them to search on. And so this just protects you a lot. So anytime you're using these bind variables and they're coming in from a user input, make sure that you are using string.escape single quotes to protect your query from malicious user input. It's one of the most important things that I see overlooked all the time, and I almost just overlooked it in my own video. So make sure to always escape single quote your search terms when they're used as bind variables in your queries. Okay, all right, everybody. And with that, I hope I've covered everything. I have no idea how long this video is, but it feels like the longest video I've ever made. And yeah. Anyway, you guys got any questions? Leave them in the comments below. I hope this has been helpful, and I will see you in whatever the next video is. Until next time, guys.